About a week ago now, U.S. Airman Aaron Bushnell self-immolated in protest of Israel's campaign in Gaza. What's happening in Gaza right now is textbook ethnic displacement. It is textbook genocide. Even the ICJ has come to a decision that it's plausible that a genocide is taking place in Gaza. There is a historical and legal basis for the claim that this is a genocide. And we here in America are living our normal lives alongside what is, again, historically, legally speaking, a genocide. He most likely felt powerless in the face of this. He had no mainstream political outlet to voice his opposition, and with the Biden administration dragging its feet on enacting real change to what's happening in Gaza, he took on the most extreme form of protest. This feels like a good time to mention that I don't condone any acts of self-harm, and that if you know a loved one or if you are thinking of committing any kind of self-harm, to seek out a support line immediately. Back to the topic at hand, Bushnell's act had everything to do with one of the realizations of the Holocaust. Evil is banal. That evil is not grand schemes and great speeches and great ideas happening over the course of, moral or anti-moral enterprises. Instead, no, evil is going along to get along. Evil is going along with a national mythology that necessitates the extermination of a group of people. Evil is just following orders when those orders are genocide. And in this case, evil is being complicit and consensual. The consent of Americans for what's happening in Gaza is unethical and it's immoral. And this is what we are surrounded by, these rationalizations for the event that's happening in Gaza every day in our media and in our daily lives with the people that we talk to. Even though this historic atrocity is taking place, you wouldn't know it looking around at American life functioning as usual. And this sort of normalcy in the face of historic genocide is nauseating. And you wouldn't know looking at the civilian layer of society in America that our government is aiding and abetting genocide in Gaza, supplying the weapons that Israel is using to bomb Gaza to bits, and supplying critical economic aid. And so what is an American to do when their constitutional right to free speech is not enough to thwart this kind of atrocity? There is no major mainstream leftist organization to voice your opinion in opposition to this event. And so I think Aaron Bushnell did the only thing he felt he could do to make a difference. That is to say, what if you're alone, like he was? You don't have a collective voice. You don't have the ability to collectively organize. I think when you are alone in the face of an event like this, you may feel like some extreme drastic measure is necessitated. Like I said, he was very much on the political left, like left of liberal, left of everything on the political spectrum, at least as far as Americans go. And there is no safe harbor for that in our media. There is no widespread acceptance of those viewpoints. Like, Americans generally are fairly center-right, like on the world spectrum. And because of that, Bushnell went to ground, he went online, and he never came back. For people who really are true believers in, ideas like liberation for the people in Gaza, there is no forum to express those viewpoints outside of the internet. And so that's usually where you'll find, people expressing ceasefire now sentiments. It won't happen on the mainstream media. This really is one of those divided we fall type moments, because many mainstream outlets are reporting his story with omissions of key context, sometimes going so far as to just leave their headlines bare of any of his political views. Going into some of these articles in more depth, you do find the context that was omitted in the headlines, but for headlines-only readers, which, there's plenty of them who just look at headlines and move on, they're only going to get the basic gist of this, that somebody self-immolated in front of the Israeli embassy here in the States, and that they were U.S. airmen. The political leanings that motivated this act are omitted. His final words even are omitted from this headline. When a headline that, includes his final words of free Palestine would have had an entirely different effect from apparently trying to communicate this in a vacuum. At a glance, each outlet that covered this event did so with some of the baseline liberal assumptions that we have heard for years about the relationship between Israel and the people it occupies, the Palestinians. Each outlet had minor ideological contradictions here and there, but none of them found it prudent to outright lie. No, if you want to do that, you do it in the Washington Post opinion column. The Washington Post piece by Ramesh Ponnuru pretty much features every bad faith argument I've seen online, in forums, and in actual outlets since this event took place. For example, when discussing the genocide taking place in Gaza, Ramesh tactically refers to it as the conflict in the Middle East, supplanting the conflict's genocide component with more of a U.S. foreign policy angle. You'll see that sometimes from people who are trying to vacuously depoliticize and render toothless certain stories. But critically, he says, Bushnell's suicide didn't teach us anything and won't save one life, essentially denying any kind of validity to what he did. I'm not endorsing any acts of extreme self-harm, political or otherwise, but it certainly got my attention. It got everybody else's attention. Day after this happened, pretty much every outlet was reporting this. And I will say, we are only about a week out from what he did, and we are starting to see a bit of a shift in public opinion. I don't know if it's permanent, but I'm seeing kind of like a sway in how anchors are talking about this. And you even have Kamala Harris calling for a 6-week ceasefire for humanitarian aid to get into Gaza. Obviously, that is not enough. And when Biden previously has called for a ceasefire and peaceful solution, Benjamin Netanyahu has actually turned that down in favor of continuing into a ground invasion of Rafah, which is at the southern border of Gaza and the northern border of Egypt, which I think would essentially fully displace any refugees from northern Gaza and push them all the way out into the Sinai Desert, effectively, putting the nail in the coffin on full displacement. But back to Ponnuru, if he thinks the most extreme form of protest is utterly meaningless and won't save a single life, I really have to question, what does he think protest matters ever? Like, does he think it has any meaning? Does he think it has any use if you were to do a highway blockage or a simple march-style protest? Are those also just completely meaningless? It really makes you wonder. On the topic of the mentally ill discourse, he brings up that before the tragic act, Bushnell was reported in police reports as having shown signs of mental distress. And I really have to say to this, I would honestly be surprised if he was not showing signs of mental distress before, tragically self-immolating in front of the embassy. It would actually be kind of weird if he showed zero signs of mental distress and absolute fortitude mentally and emotionally right before his major act. And on the topic of the mentally ill discourse in general, I just want to say that I feel like it belies a kind of faux common sense approach to analyzing events like this, these sort of, self-sacrificing political type events, rendering them apolitical and applying this like emotional closeness to them that we wouldn't have applied to, say, this guy. Was he mentally ill back in the day protesting Vietnam? You really got to wonder, will people have the same take on this a few years from now with the clarity of looking back on history? And yeah, another thing Ponnuru does is he claims that positive receptions or positive receptions of Bushnell's political message after this act are doing a job of portraying suicide as righteous and productive, which if you look at even the quotes included in the piece, they do not do anything of the kind. They mainly keep the conversation political with a sort of reverence and a deference to the sacrifice one person made for their political beliefs. We, in hindsight, can't really question what was going through his head before he did that, but we certainly can listen to his political message. Free Palestine. Free Palestine. Like Cornel West, Jill Stein, they have, they're the ones being shot at by Benoru here. They did not say anything of the kind to suggest that suicide is inherently productive as a means of protest. So that's just a bad faith attack right there. He does get something right in calling for readers to not follow in Bushnell's footsteps. I do think that is good to include, but at the same time, in the same sentence even, Benoru calls his death senseless, which is pretty insulting in my opinion. It implies that Bushnell had zero agency, that he was just a mentally ill political pawn, and that's just not something you would say of, again, this guy or anybody else acting as a historical figure. It's just something you can say in the present moment to kind of depoliticize the conversation. So yeah, Benoru and other mainstream media spinsters are trying to tell this story essentially in a vacuum without its critical political context. And because Bushnell has no major political representation, no PR firm, no rep, no org to comment on his actions, he has no one sticking up for him to explain why this happened and to make a statement on this on his behalf. We will all continue to tepidly keep him in our hearts, but ultimately he was alone in making the statement that he did. And because of that, there's no one there to kind of add context, and his story can be manipulated to fit whatever ends people want it to fit into. Needless to say, Bushnell got my attention. He got everybody else's attention in the media. It had some kind of effect on the discourse, and if I'm being optimistic here, there might even be a little bit of a sway of public opinion, although the Biden administration's current bending to the political public opinion of the genocide in Gaza might have more to do with the 100,000 uncommitted votes coming out of Michigan. I would figure that kind of scared them because it's a really major number that could be of critical importance come November. But nevertheless, this issue is changing hearts and minds, and I like to think when it was top of mind for a day because of Aaron Bushnell, that at least was a positive thing that came at a grave cost. So I just want to say that it falls to ordinary people to talk about this in a way that is good faith, that respects the wishes of Aaron Bushnell, that shows some kind of deference to his political message, rather than trying to spin this to fit some kind of narrative, rather than trying to water it down or depoliticize what he was trying to say. At this point, the casualties in Gaza are starting to reach 40,000, with many of those being women, children, and the elderly. There's just a new horror story pretty much every week, with the idea of usually claiming no fault or saying that the event never happened. There's really no end in sight to this. The Israelis are going after the refugee camps, going after aid trucks that are getting visited by Gazan civilians. It's really grotesque. And at the moment, the situation shows zero sign of improving either.
Bibi Netanyahu is going nowhere. Most Israelis may dislike him, but they approve of his war policies. This week, in a pointed rebuke to international calls to pursue a two-state solution, including from the U.S. and Britain, Israel's Knesset approved a resolution declaring that it was opposed to any unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state, with 99 out of 120 votes.
So yeah, it's really turned grim in ways I never thought possible. I have to imagine the feeling of powerlessness Aaron Bushnell felt before the end must have been nauseating. And in this extreme political moment in which we are kind of sitting idly by while this is happening in another country, using resources that our government is supplying, yeah, I mean, acts of protest are certainly called for. Again, I don't condone any kind of extreme self-harm. I would encourage you to seek out a support line if you are considering something like that. I would advise you to not follow in Bushnell's footsteps, but do remember his political message. We need to have a free Palestine and ceasefire now.